Hello, I'm Lisa Harker, Director of the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory. Welcome to this webinar on extra-familial risks and harms, trauma-informed responses and the implications for the family courts. Nuffield Family Justice Observatory works to improve the lives of children and families by putting data and evidence at the heart of the family justice system. We seek to find and fill the gaps in our understanding of the system, highlight areas where change will make the biggest impact, and foster collaboration to make that happen. One of our focus areas is older children and young people, and how we can improve outcomes for them within the family justice system. We've seen the number of young people, those aged between 10 and 17, subject to care proceedings significantly increase in the last 10 years. There's been a 95% increase in England over that period. And our analysis last year of the files from the East London Family Court and research and practices analysis of files from 4 local authorities showed that extra-familial risks such as criminal or sexual exploitation are present in a number of older children's cases. In the research and practice audit, in about 25% of those cases. The analysis also showed us that risks from outside the home rarely happen in isolation. Children who are already experiencing harm or instability within their own family are more at risk of risk outside the home. But it is clear that responding successfully to young people's needs within the system must involve understanding and recognition of the extra-familial contexts. And with that in mind, I'm really pleased to welcome our 2 guest speakers today, Professor Carleen Furman and Professor Michelle Lefebvre, who are leading the ESRC-funded Innovate Project, which is examining innovations in how children's social care departments and teams are addressing extra-familial risks and harms. Michelle is Professor of Social Work and the Director of the Centre of Innovation and Research in Childhood and Youth at the University of Sussex. And Carleen is Professor of Social Work at Durham University. She's the founder of contextual safeguarding, which, as you know, is a pioneering concept which grounds approaches to child protection in the extra-familial context of the child. We're very much looking forward to hearing about their groundbreaking work over the course of this event. Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about the format of the event. Carleen and Michelle's presentations will be followed by a panel discussion where they will also be joined by Susanna Bauer from Research and Practice and Nicole Savage from North Lanarkshire Council. There are a lot of you attending today's event, and while we won't be able to see you during the event, we do want to hear from you. So please share your questions and your comments in the chat tab. Thank you to everyone who's already sent their questions in advance of the webinar. We're going to try and address as many questions as we can. All the comments and all the questions will be read by the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory team, and this will help to shape future research and events. We're recording today's event and it will be available via our website if you'd like to revisit the discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Carleen and Michelle, and we're really pleased to have you with us here today.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It's lovely to be here today. I know we're both really excited to be able to talk about our project and to share some of our findings and discuss those. Can you see the PowerPoint? Okay, yeah. Just pop it onto slideshow. Here we are then. So, as Lisa said, Carleen and I worked together on the Innovate Project, which is a project looking at extra-familial risks and harm and particular service responses to that. The project's funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and there's 4 organisations currently involved. Ourselves at Sussex, Durham University, Research and Practice and Innovation Unit. So we'll talk a bit about who we are and what we're doing, a bit about the whole concept of extra-familial risks and harms. What does it mean and what are some of the challenges with definitions and so on? why we're saying we think there needs to be innovation and not just service improvement in order to address these particular kinds of risks and harms. And then we'll look specifically at trauma-informed practice as one of the 3 approaches we're considering, specifically sharing some of the emergent findings from some of the work we're doing in particular local authorities, and then just end up with a few implications for policy, for practice, and for future research through the project. So this is us. It's a 4-year project. We were a bit horrified the other day to realise that we've only got 18 months to go. It seems like such a long time at the beginning. But we're looking at 3 things. So the Economic and Social Research Council was interested themselves in social care innovation. I'm sure that most of you will be aware that the government, Department for Education in particular, has put a lot of money into innovation as a way of developing services for children, young people and families. And they were wanting to understand what are the processes of innovation and how can we invest well in public services to improve the lives of vulnerable people. So we made a bid that was about this particular issue, extra-familial risk and harm in adolescence, recognising that this was a growing field and a real recognition of difficulties that services were struggling terribly with. And so we said we would look at these particular frameworks. So trauma-informed practice that we're looking at today, contextual safeguarding, which everybody knows Carleen has taken this major role in developing, and transitional safeguarding, which is thinking about the links between children's services and adult services, and this gap that can happen at 18, that young people can fall off. This kind of notion that actually all the vulnerability stops at 18, and all the rights don't begin before 18. So that's what the transitional safeguarding is about. So this particular issue, and we've grouped them together in a kind of a longer category than often gets used. Working together, I think, uses extra-familial threats, and other documents use risks beyond the home, risks outside of the family, extra-familial risks or extra-familial harms. And we wanted to create a larger umbrella category in the recognition that by making plurals, there are a number of very different, divergent risks and harms. And we've distinguished those 2 terms. We think that most young people, if not all young people, experience risks outside of the family home, but not for all of them does this turn into harm. So some young people are able to safely navigate their way through those risks with the support of friends, family, other situations, their own resilience and agency. So we're trying to create this term as a way of thinking about what this might mean, but also in recognition that they aren't just there or in and of themselves. It's not just about exploitation. It's not just about gang affiliation. It's about a safeguarding system that struggles to manage these things. And actually, that's the most important defining characteristic of this term that we've created here. So down the left-hand side here, I've just labelled some of the most common harm types that people consider. And we're in the last dying throes of writing a book at the moment that's going to the publishers in 2 weeks' time. And what we have really kind of focused on, I think, in that is how different across the world these different harm types are understood, thought about, labelled and responded to. It's changed massively over time. You know, as a baby social worker very, very many years ago, these terms didn't exist. And they certainly, even if the type of harm was understood, were not responded to largely by child and family social work. So there's been this massive growing recognition that these things not only happen, but they cause harm that's a safeguarding harm. It's not just something that happens outside of our considerations. So what we also have that relates to that are a number of evidence problems. Because largely the literature doesn't constitute these as a single category, when we have been reviewing the literature to find out, well, what is the evidence base on this, we really struggled. There are different terms for child sexual exploitation, for example. So in North America, largely terms like domestic minor sex trafficking are used, although in the legal sense, child sexual exploitation is also used. The commercial sexual exploitation of children is distinguished from other forms of sexual exploitation. So actually to search and make sense of whether these require the same sorts of responses and whether we can build together an evidence base around these is really problematic. Criminal exploitation too has different manifestations. It's a term, again, largely driven by the UK. Modern slavery as well has a big overlap with that, but different countries, again, don't necessarily even understand or recognise that. And this manifestation of county lines seems to be very particular to the UK, probably as a mark of its smaller size in this country and quite extensive public transport networks that young people are able to use when they're being pushed around to sell and distribute drugs in particular kinds of ways. So we think that this lack of a categorization means there's this lack of also a unified response and the lack of a sense of how should we respond in these kinds of ways. So the third strand of problem we've identified relates to the nature of adolescence too. So much of the literature struggles around this notion of should we be focusing on young people's vulnerability and their victimhood, in which case we should actually seek to have responses which control and guide and protect these young people. This is a relatively new approach to dealing with extrafamilial risks and harm. If we go back 10 years, child sexual exploitation was only just coming to public attention. And what was happening at that time is the newly constituted way of recognising it as a safeguarding risk took it forward from having been seen as child prostitution. And the very big scandals, the big public inquiries in Rochdale and Rotherham and Oxfordshire and so on, were recognising that these young people had just been left in very, very dangerous situations because nobody saw that it was the role of an outsider to intervene. That's all shifted massively. And when myself and my colleague Christine Hickel at Sussex did some research back in 2016, we found that things had swung so far the other direction that in fact young people's agency and their choice, their autonomy and their privacy was in fact ignored and set aside in favour of a safeguarding kind of response. What we also see is a kind of, Carlene's done much research around this, kind of constraining responses to put young people in secure accommodations as well to deal with this. So I think this kind of response that happens internationally, this struggle, this move back and forth between how do we respond victim, or do we respond as a young person who's agendic and actually seen as responsible? And that pushes us into this other difficult boundary in terms of young people's involvement as potential perpetrators. The systems do not manage well young people who straddle the boundaries between victimhood and criminality. They're often dealt with by very, very different parts of the system. So child and family social work will deal with a particular sense of vulnerability, but if in fact, what is seen mostly is that young people are responsible for what they've done and they need a criminal justice response. Actually, the vulnerability and the victimhood can get missed. And this is where trauma-informed practice starts to come in, because what we have to do is understand what the role trauma plays in these kinds of things. We understand trauma as a kind of a response to earlier developmental trauma and making someone more vulnerable to later exploitation and being captured by extrafamilial risks. And we also understand that trauma is an effect of being caught up in extrafamilial harm. So this role of trauma helps us understand the meaning of behaviours and helps us give us a way into that. And that's what Carlene will focus on in a moment. So as I was mentioning there, there's a real struggle for systems in knowing how to manage these. But what we've come through by reviewing the international literature is a way of recognising different principles that belong to systems and interventions. So we know that across the way, really, systems need to be contextual in the way that Carlene has examined in her work, but they also need to be relational. They mustn't put these two things in opposition absolutely at all. They need to be interagency in the way that they're delivered. So that's both a system response, but it's also how individual practitioners are able to operate within those systems as well. And we need youth relevant and youth centered systems that enable the individual practitioners in their interventions to be youth centered in their responses. What we've seen through these kinds of things is it's impossible for individual practitioners most of the time to do any of this unless they are held, surrounded, supported and promoted by the wider system. But actually, as we've just noted, the systems themselves aren't set up to do this. In this country in particular, but most other countries too, child and family social work doesn't actually take account of how we work with agency. It doesn't take account of young people who do straddle these different perpetrator victim binaries and so on. So what we're going to be proposing, and we'll see through what's happening in the local authorities who are taking forward trauma-informed practice, are new ways of thinking about who needs support and who needs protection, and how do they do that. We're suggesting a broadening of the social work response. We're not suggesting that social work says, okay, this stuff's really important, but let's give that to someone else to deal with that. We're suggesting an extension of this and a recalibration of that role. We're suggesting working across agency silos, working with voluntary sector, we're working with all the different agencies together to find responses that do all of these things on this slide. So that's just a little bit of a brief introduction into the why we think innovation is important. Because what innovation does is it transforms systems and it transforms paradigms. I used the term wicked problems earlier, and what wicked problems are kind of entrenched problems that can't be dealt with in the way that things are already. They require us to kind of disrupt right from the beginning. I used to work in a system that said, I wish we hadn't started from there. And actually, what we'd like to do with innovation is not start from there. We'd actually like to throw things out and say, okay, if we can redesign from scratch, how would we do this on the kind of principles that we're finding out here? So we, through our project, I think, are trying to work with services, organisations, local authorities to find new ways of doing things, which will be disruptive, but will transform experiences and outcomes for children, young people and families. So this is the point I'm going to hand over to Carleen. So I'm going to stop sharing there.
Thanks, Michelle, and I will start sharing. It's really great to be able to follow that presentation by exploring in a little bit more detail how some of the data we're collecting from sites and from our wider learning and development network suggest trauma-informed practice may help in addressing some of these challenges that Michelle has outlined. So in terms of trauma-informed practice and how we're defining it in the project, I oversee the work stream on trauma-informed practice in the Innovate Project. So I lead our research into 2 sites that are using trauma-informed practice, and then convened a wider learning and development network with my colleague Carly Goldsmith and Ray and Majalik. And the framework we use to understand trauma-informed practice is on the slide in front of you. So when we are talking about whether or not a service or an organisation or a team is adopting a trauma-informed approach, what we're asking is it adopting an approach that's able to provide safety, both internal and external safety? Is it forged on relationships and collaborations of trust? Do those relationships provide a sense of choice, real choice to those involved? Are they collaborative, so give and take rather than done to? And are people empowered through that process? And I've been quite general in terms of how I've introduced those 5 pillars of trauma-informed practice, because in the Innovate Project, we're looking at how those would play out in interactions between professionals and young people. So in those interactions, are young people provided with a sense of safety internally and externally? Is there trust between young people and professionals? Do young people experience a sense of choice? Are they able to collaborate on plans to keep them safe in respect of extra-familial harm and risks? And are they do experience these processes as empowering? But we are also interested in these 5 domains in respect of children's social care workforce. So do they feel safe? Are they able to work in spaces of trust with young people, families, and also with colleagues? Do they have access to choices in terms of what they're able to offer and provide to young people? Are they able to collaborate with partner agencies to find resolutions? And are they empowered to create change for young people? And then thirdly, we're interested in how this plays out at an organisational level in terms of policies, procedures, structures for supervision, the design of service buildings, and so on and so forth. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the first 2, so interactions with young people and support for workforce. But over the course of the Innovate project in the trauma-informed strand, we're looking about each of these 3 areas where we would expect to see trauma-informed practice, and what they mean for extra-familial risks and harms. Now, I guess what's important to note is that as we worked through our first stage of data collection in our participant sites, it became quite clear quite early on, and we worked with Christy Hickle, who's our expert advisor on trauma-informed practice on this project, is that there's very little out there that articulates what a trauma-informed response would be specifically for young people affected by extra-familial risks and harms. So unlike some of the other innovations we're looking at in the project, like contextual safeguarding, trauma-informed responses are far broader than extra-familial risks and harms. They've been applied into services and organisations to capture a range of things that are beyond the scope of this project, whereas contextual safeguarding was specifically introduced for the issue of extra-familial risk and harm. So when we look at what's been published, there is very little that's specific to how trauma-informed responses would apply for young people affected by extra-familial risk and harm. And so as we've started to analyse the data collected in the first round of data collection for our project, we've mapped what we've seen in services against those 5 pillars of a trauma-informed approach, thinking that for young people who are affected by extra-familial harm, if a trauma-informed response was being adopted, what we would expect to see are efforts being made to create relational, physical, and psychological safety for the young people involved. And I'm going to go into that in a bit more detail on the next slide. That young people affected by these issues are provided with consistent relationships in which there's evidence that professionals are advocating on their behalf, and that this in turn fosters trust between the young person and the professional. That situations are created in which young people affected by extra-familial risks and harms can exercise choices that in turn facilitate their safety. So choices about plans, access to services, support, who they might spend their time with, and so on. And in exercising those choices, efforts are made to understand the drivers of young people's behaviour, so that this understanding can inform collaborative safety planning between young people and professionals. And when we've done case review in our data collection, we've seen some of that collaboration where young people take a sense of ownership, and it really engages with what Michelle was describing before in terms of young people's sense of agency during adolescence. And finally, that in this process of responding to young people affected by extra-familial harm, those young people are supported to identify opportunities that go beyond extra-familial risks and harms, that the whole intervention isn't just about that, but actually empowering work is undertaken to support them to work towards a more hopeful future. And again, when we look in case notes, the extent to which we see professionals describing the entirety of a young person, their likes and dislikes, their hopes for the future, not solely the risks they may be exposed to or the harms they may have experienced. So these are the types of approaches we would expect to see in an organisation where young people are being supported due to extra-familial risks and harms, and that organisation is taking a trauma-informed approach. Now, focusing a little bit more on safety as one of those 5 areas, we've been very much informed by Lucy Shuker's work on multidimensional safety, thinking about what are services doing to create safety for young people. That's physical safety, psychological safety, and relational safety. And in terms of trauma-informed responses, we see organisations responding to that external need for safety and that internal need for safety. In terms of external, we see a range of interventions being used to try to physically safeguard young people's welfare. And Michelle mentioned some of those, so including the use of distance and out of area placements in care for young people exposed to harm in their local communities. At the most extreme end, the use of secure placements, sometimes to contain young people who are going through multiple experiences of extrafamilial risks and harms, or who are exposed to those harms and where there's a threat to life. Or other kind of containing and controlling interventions like the use of curfews or dispersing young people away from public spaces where they may be at harm, or very behaviour focused interventions on their use of substances, for example, or on school attendance to get them into school when they're not attending, with a view that if they're in school they're safer than when they're outside of school, or to reduce their use of substances so that they won't be intoxicated or under the influence of substances when spending time with peers. All of these interventions largely focus on control and safety through physically controlling young people's exposure to harm. Now, what we also see are efforts to create internal safety for young people, particularly psychological safety, and some sites the use of various therapies, including equine therapy, being used for young people. Various coping mechanisms being explored for them, with practitioners helping them think through what are the things that nurture and help them keep safe in moments of crisis. Roles played by educational psychologists in some areas to think through young people's needs, experiences, wants and desires, and how can they be managed and contained by a professional network. And various de-escalation techniques being used in places, particularly residential placements, for example, to support young people impacted by extrafamilial risks and harms. What's quite interesting sometimes is the relationship between those physical and psychological approaches to safety, where some efforts at creating physical safety might undermine the psychological welfare of some young people. For example, behaviour-focused interventions at reducing substance use, for example, may reduce what for that young person is a coping mechanism. And without an alternative coping mechanism in place, efforts to build physical safety may actually undermine psychological safety for that young person. But what seems most critical in sites that are developing a trauma-informed approach is the safety that young people achieve through relationships. And indeed, as a baseline for what we've ended up looking at in sites is whether or not there are those relationships between professionals and young people that are based on trust and collaboration. And it's through that kind of basis of relational work that trauma-informed practice can be built. But what we've also noticed is that professional relationships are likely to be insufficient on their own, because what young people also seem to need are safe relationships with family, with peers, and with their wider community. Non-referral based relationships, relationships that exist beyond the life of statutory interventions and that aren't time limited. And more thinking is probably required in sites that are using trauma-informed practices to think about how that broader relational work also fits. So what we also see is trauma-informed responses creating psychological safety for young people in very physically sterile or artificial settings, like a secure placement. So place a young person physically in a secure placement to remove them from physical risk, creating the space for them to develop psychological safety. In those settings, what we don't have is the space to develop sustained relational safety. When young people come back out of those settings to family, peers or community, that can destabilize their physical safety and then their psychological safety. So these things are all intertwined, and what we need to think about is the extent to which trauma-informed practice can bridge all of those for us, and that's what we continue to explore. Now, thinking a bit more about relational safety in respective professionals, one of the things we've been grappling with is how you create those trusted relationships between professionals and young people that demonstrate those 5 characteristics of a trauma-informed approach that provide safety, are built on trust, are collaborative, are empowering and feature choice. And one of the things we've been reflecting on is the extent to which professionals know young people, or professionals work in services that know those young people. How we would say, this young person is known to our service, or this young person is known by this professional. So in situations where young people are known to services, what we often see in the subtext are young people being talked about by professionals and by wider services. And these conversations occurring amidst multiple and often short-term contacts with services, with multiple re-referrals, or this young person's been referred back in again, they're already known to us, we've assessed before, and so on. They may be known because they've been mapped on various matrices and lists and profiles that often characterise our response to extra-familial risk and harm. They're connected to that young person, they featured in that incident, they've been risk rated on that profile related to exploitation. And professionals will hold chronologies of various incidents that have happened to them. This is very different to situations where young people are known by the professionals or people who are supporting them. Because rather than being talked about by professionals, what we see are young people being talked with by professionals. So not about, but with. Instead of multiple and often short-term contact with services, we see sustained or time-relevant contact with professionals until their needs have been met. Rather than accounts of their experiences that are based on mapping exercises or chronologies of incidents that have happened, we see professionals provide narratives of this young person's interests, their ambitions, their fears. These are all held and communicated by professionals who are advocating for their needs. So they really know these young people outside of particular incidents of extrafamilial harm. And professionals have taken time to understand key points in a young person's chronology from their perspective, which may be out with chronologies that professionals or wider services consider to be critical incidents. And so when we're thinking about the ability of services or teams to develop a trauma-informed approach, we would want to see organisations aligning more to relationships where young people are known by professionals, and less where young people are known to services. But for professionals to be able to provide that type of relational safety, it's important to consider that other dimension of trauma-informed practice that I mentioned at the start. We're not just interested in the extent to which young people have access to or experience a trauma-informed response, but whether the workforce is held in a trauma-informed organisation. So for professionals to be able to know and work with young people, what they seem to require is a sense of safety that can be sometimes provided through supervision, where they're able to recognise and manage the impact of the work they're doing on their well-being. Extrafamilial risks and harms can be extremely anxiety-provoking for professionals. There can be concern that young people will experience severe or fatal harm while they're being supported, and there needs to be a place for those anxieties and concerns to go and be reflected upon. Professionals also need to have relationships of trust, particularly relationships of trust between social care and wider partner agencies, where boundaries are respected to enable a social care professional to be alongside and advocating for a young person, and what might be needed to protect that relationship, as well as engage in a trusted relationship with the wider partnership. Practitioners also need to have access to resources that they can offer young people so that choice can feature in those relationships. What we sometimes see is a limited set of options for support or interventions. And so even though a practitioner may know and understand what a young person impacted by extrafamilial risks or harms needs, actually what they need is not provided for by the services in which they work or the wider budgets that are available. And this can make the relationship between the practitioner and young person then feel disingenuous, because this young person has said what they've needed and the practitioner's offered something completely different. So resourcing appears to be critical in terms of being able to provide choice in those relationships. Again, collaboration to be a feature of the relationships that professionals have with partner agencies, as well as the relationships they have with young people. And to be able to collaborate, there needs to be a recognition that social care, policing and health, for example, are operating in completely different organisational cultures, and how you work across and between those cultures needs to be addressed in order to support meaningful collaboration, which may involve on occasion challenge. And it can be really important for practitioners to feel able to identify and share with a young person the shortfalls of previous responses. We've noticed in some of our data that practitioners have been able to say and acknowledge to a young person that things have gone wrong historically, that placements haven't worked, that an intervention wasn't helpful, that a practitioner made a mistake. And that can be quite difficult in some practice settings, but actually it can be empowering for a professional to be able to acknowledge where things haven't worked in order to progress with a different direction of travel in the future, rather than having to hide or shy away from where things may have been less than ideal. We see these 5 features of trauma-informed practice being critical to supporting those in workforces who are charged with responding to extra-familial harm, and that these features would evidence a trauma-informed response amongst that workforce. So what we see is then a relationship between the things I've been describing to you this afternoon. If we want a trauma-informed response to extra-familial risks and harms, what we need are responses that provide relational safety for young people, as well as physical and psychological safety. But to understand that relational safety, we have to think about relationships that go beyond referral-based relationships and are consistent and sustained relationships with professionals, but also with family, peers, and wider communities. But in order to provide that multidimensional experience of relational safety, young people need to be known by the professionals who are supporting them, rather than known solely to the services they're referred into. And this would be characterised by safe professional relationships with young people. But to provide those safe professional relationships, those practitioners require a trauma-informed framework that's holding the workforce and providing them with a sense of safety, empowerment, trust, collaboration and choice in the work that they do. None of that is easy, and goes right back to what Michelle was saying at the start of this presentation, that when you really think deeply about the approaches that we are exploring in this project, you are talking about approaches that require innovation, that require transformation and a disruption of a system to be able to create something that looks like this. It's not enough to deliver a service that simply acknowledges this young person may be experiencing trauma. To be able to avoid re-traumatization, work with that young person and ensure the safety of a workforce using trauma-informed practice, significant changes at multiple levels are likely to be needed within a team, an organisation and a wider partnership. So for those working in the context of family justice, this raises multiple questions, and I'm really interested to follow this with a discussion, and I hope this overview has prompted some thoughts from you. But for me, the ones that were clear in my head when I was preparing for today was to be thinking about how psychological safety and relational safety are considered in decisions that are made about the use of secure placements for young people, as Michelle said. The extent to which the work prior to such a placement would have achieved this, and whether a secure placement will disrupt any of this. But indeed the plan that goes around the use of the secure placement, so that should the placement provide a young person with a moment of psychological safety, how we can maintain that sense of psychological safety when they are no longer in a placement, and how relationships may play a critical role in that, including relationships that are non-professional, and how much that's being considered in the planning process. Linked to this is a question about planning for young people more generally, young people in care, young people on the edge of care, young people in secure placements. How are these plans considering young people's relationships beyond those they have with professionals, And potentially beyond those, they have with parents and carers, so relationships with peers, relationships with community. And this intersects with one of the other innovations that we're exploring in terms of transitional safeguarding. As the older young people get, the more the kind of friends and contacts they select for themselves become critical in grounding them and providing a sense of self and sense of safety. How much of that is being considered in planning processes? And whether we're planning for a secure placement or an alternative placement for a young person, there's more thinking to be done about whether professional accounts of young people that inform those plans and assessments suggest that this is a young person who is known by practitioners and the plan reflects that young person's broader identity, needs and wants, or whether this is a young person who is known to services alone, services that may be holding a lot of anxiety, may be exhausted by the demands that supporting this young person is placing on the service. And so the plan is about managing those demands rather than attending to the needs of those young people. What difference would it make to plans if they're based on what a practitioner knows of a young person as opposed to what a service believes to be the impact of a young person on the provisions they can make? So I go back to these 5 pillars of trauma-informed practice. When we're thinking about family justice in its broadest sense, to what extent is that system creating its internal and external safety for young people affected by extrafamilial harm? To what sense does it foster trust, that a young person can trust the system, trust the services being put in place for them? Does it enable choice for young people, or is it really there to constrain and curtail choice? To what extent are young people invited to collaborate on decisions that are made about them and for them within that system? And might they experience the system as empowering, or is this a part of the system where we're yet to achieve that through a lens of trauma-informed practice? So that's all from me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I look forward to our conversation.
Colleen and Michelle, thank you both very much for a really stimulating and very, very clear presentation. I'm sure we've got loads to discuss and I can see the chat. There's lots of questions already coming through. We're going to now take some time to talk about what you've heard as part of a panel. So Michelle and Colleen will now be joined by Susanna Boyer, who's Assistant Director of Research and Practice, and Nicole Savage, who's a Senior Officer and leading contextual safeguarding implementation at North Lanarkshire Council. So we've got lots of questions that were sent in advance of today's webinar, and thank you to all of those who sent questions. But also I want to try and address as many in the chat as possible. Why don't we start with a question that's come through in the chat as you've been talking. And I think this is for Colleen and Michelle actually to think about. So this is from Birmingham Children's Trust, who have implemented a trust-wide practice model, and they are asking about how that might be evaluated. So is there something you could say about how you evaluate outcomes and the impact of taking a trauma-informed approach? And are there any specific methodologies, measures or tools that they should be considering?
You want to go first, Carleen, or shall I? Shall I go first? Okay. I think that's really interesting. And I've been doing a lot of evaluation of contextual safeguarding recently. And I think what that has done is highlighted for me, and talking with Carleen about that, what it is that both the system provides and individual practitioners can provide. And we have to measure both, so that it's really complex, I think, in some of these situations to understand what would be the markers of saying that success has been achieved. So success for whom? And so I often use the model of contribution analysis, because I think that's just a really useful approach for helping us think about, well, in what way has this particular model contributed to changes in outcomes? So first of all, you have to know, are there changes in outcomes? And if so, what might have led to that? And also what we would call the counterfactual in research. What would have happened in the absence of this intervention? What would have happened if we had done nothing at all? Things still change anyway, because actually the environment out there is so fast moving all of the time. So policies change. I was just seeing today there's been a change again around stop and search, for example, with young people. That kind of policy and changes in practice by the police make enormous differences. And whatever good kind of local authority might do around trauma-informed practice, actually in that wider context, if those things are happening, we have to understand how all these things interface together. So it fits a bit with what I was saying earlier. Things have to be interagency in their understanding. So even if a new approach is led by, say, children's social care or one particular organisation, how everybody operates together is really important to understand. I said a moment ago about knowing whether things have changed, and we've done a lot of work around looking at quantitative data and what that might tell us about outcomes and what it doesn't tell us about outcomes. Colleen and I have just written a chapter called Counting Children or Chip Shops. We can count things, but are they meaningful? What do they tell us about the intervention itself? So Carling's labelled very carefully the trust, safety, choice, collaboration, empowerment. Those are the things that matter. What is the system doing in relation to those things? So we need to do something around process change as part of any evaluation. So we think about the theory of change. We establish a theory of change right at the beginning, and that tells us what we think will happen if we do certain things. So the process change model allows us to make changes in the system, understand how those changes in the system might change the behaviour of practitioners, whether practitioners feel more confident, more capable as a result of doing those things, whether the system helps them do those sorts of things. So those are steps along the way. And the next outcome should be children, young people, families notice something different about the service. Hopefully they feel it's more youth-centred, more respectful, more rights-focused, those sorts of things. And then the end outcomes, are children and young people safer as a result? Is their well-being supported as a result of that? And what kind of markers in the system might tell us some of those things, both quantitatively and qualitatively? That was a very long answer, sorry.
That was great, thank you. Is there anything else you want to add, Carleen, to that?
No, I thought it was a very full answer. Nothing else, and it was great.
Thank you both. But I want to come to the question of the court in particular, and you touched on this, Carleen, in your presentation. We had a number of questions sent to us in advance about this particular issue. You talked really eloquently about this needing to be about innovation and doing things differently and disrupting the current system. Many of the questions we got about the court part of the process was questioning how far courts can adopt a trauma-informed approach. We had a question from a kinship carer who said, I'm concerned that professionals don't place any real importance on trauma-informed care, and judges don't even consider this when families pass through their courts and decisions are made. There was somebody else who asked, how do you balance the requirements of the court process with taking a trauma-informed approach? And a third question, if I just bundled all these together, was about what one question do you think family courts should ask partner agencies to focus on in terms of a trauma-informed approach, getting the right things right? So I suppose those questions all point to a set of challenges around how you change the court process. You've given us a really nice framework to work on. Is that a framework that could be translated into the sorts of questions that could be raised within the courts by judges about how young people are being supported?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the kind of general framework for trauma-informed practice is helpful in a number of different ways, in a number of different settings, and applying them to the specific setting and asking questions of it, I think, is a good place to start. The other thing we know from trauma-informed practice is a lot of what it's asking is not just what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. And I think that is where there's potentially some flexibility, because while you need to do certain activities, arguably, in a court setting, how you do them, there may be some window of flexibility there in terms of how you talk to somebody, the types of questions you ask of professionals as well as of the young person. Doesn't mean you're not going to make a decision about secure, for example, but asking of the plan or recommendations around the court process, recommendations made for that young person, whether or not it tells you anything about who this young person is, beyond the risk that everyone's trying to manage, but actually not losing their sense of self in that process is really important. Who is their trusted professional, and are they walking that journey with them so that they're not alone? What is asked of professionals in terms of what is their plan beyond this placement? What is the plan? Because a secure placement is not an outcome. It's very time limited. So if we want to, and as much of the work I've done on contextual safeguarding obviously tries to create safety where the young person is, there's no way I'd ever say you never would secure. Of course there are situations where at the moment we need to secure young people, but we need to be asking what is the plan beyond that, because if we want the secure placement to be meaningful and for any psychological safety created in that placement to extend beyond the life of the placement, there needs to be a plan that goes beyond the life of the placement. And that plan can't solely be about fixing this child. That plan has to be about addressing the situation this child is now in. And questions can be asked of the plan. Questions can be asked of those young person's needs and desires. Questions can be asked of, where is that young person safe? Where are they unsafe at the moment, according to them? And we've seen some of those changes in child protection conferences in some areas. We're just asking the where are you safe and unsafe, and not just what are we worried about, but where are we worried about it? They might not change the final decision, but they characterize how that decision's been made. And that's important for the message that young person takes away about who they are, and what this risk has to do with them and their decisions, and what may be in place for them after, because it's a point of intervention and you don't want that point of intervention to be one that sends them on an even more traumatic trajectory. But I'm sure other panel members who are more involved in those types of decisions will have other points to add on that.
Well, I'd like to bring Nicole in now, actually, and ask her to talk a bit about her experience in Scotland, which has a different justice system to England and Wales. But perhaps, Nicole, you could talk a bit about the context in which you're working, the care review that's taken place in Scotland, and how that's started to change practice in reality. Nicole.
I suppose just want to kind of follow on from what Caroline was speaking about in terms of the system around young people needs to be, everybody needs to be trauma informed, especially when we're thinking about the kind of the Youth Justice Forum, because what practitioners kind of feel when they're trying to contain a young person is that they could be trauma informed, but if the systems around about that young person aren't, they are this frustration that builds up. And for that, I can think of a number of different examples where, for example, a lawyer might not get in touch with a young person until 15 minutes or half an hour before the court. And so the young person's anxiety is there, it's palatable, they might not want to be in that environment. And so probably the person that's the most trusted individual person for them is trying to contain that, but also do their role, actually try and work through the system, explain the system to them. And how we've kind of managed that is building examples of innovative practice and giving other practitioners the confidence to step outside of their role and think about their relationship. And for that, Caroline had earlier mentioned that educational psychology have been involved. So we had a young person who his educational psychologist was the longest standing member of his team. She followed him through all the different placements, and she knew him inside out. And there was an occasion where there was a choice between a duty social worker picking the young person up from spending a night in the cells, or his educational psychologist, and it was the educational psychologist. And that was about the relationship. It was about her having the kind of awareness of, I am important to this young person, this is important. And so to get them from A to B, knowing the difference in lots of different kind of transitions this young person would go through, she held them, and it kind of freed up other practitioners to do other parts of the work. So I suppose what I'm kind of saying is that the experience for young people is within our gift just now. So what we can do is, and I suppose when we're thinking about measurable outcomes, everybody's got an agenda. We want to see young people going missing less, or there's less kind of charges that are going before a sheriff. But what we want to do is bring back the kind of message that it's everybody's responsibility. We're all corporate parents, we're all got pivotal parts of the system to kind of play out, and then the young person will feel that there's trust, because you don't want to be the only trusted adult in that young person's life. That's not sustainable for the rest of their life. People come and go, but they also need to see that as practitioners, you can challenge other parts of the system, but you don't fall out. You challenge, you hear what each other are saying, and you build bridges. That's modelling healthy and unhealthy kind of relationships. So I suppose where we're at in North Lanarkshire just now, I feel so fortunate that I have some managers that not only kind of walk the walk, not only talk the talk, they walk the walk. They make sure that when they are relating to practitioners, we have the child in mind in every single meeting that's there, and that's the expectation. That's what you know, people challenge if you don't. They always want to hear a young person's perspective. And again, what's been very different for us is you can have a perspective and you really know a young person, but their narrative is still different. So I think that's been really key for us. And what we're doing just now is we're trying to build a really clear feedback loop. So our practitioners forum is trying to kind of be the middle ground between the voices of practitioners and young people and the systems that make decisions. And that needs to go up and down, not tokenistically, but genuinely. We need to hear. And I suppose we're trying to encourage practitioners, if they are frustrated about something in the system, rather than kind of moaning and not feeling that you can do anything about it, let's empower them, let's take it somewhere, let's show them that we might not be able to do everything overnight, but if everybody's saying similar things, which we are, because there's a lot of similarities in terms of frustrations that come up with extra-familial harm, like school exclusions, like securing, going to secure, where young people maybe need to leave their health service to go to the place that geographically that the service is in. That's disruptive. So what we're trying to do is trying to actually isolate what is it that people are continually saying is difficult, and collectively take that information up. So yeah.
To what extent is the promise and the work of the care review in Scotland change the context for you?
So the care review it's massive, it's pivotal, and it's inspirational. So in 2016, I think Nicola Sturgeon had announced that Scotland needs to do better by care experienced young people. We need to listen to them, we need to give them a voice, and they need to be part of changing services. So I think there's like 5 different pillars that are kind of looked at. I think it was 5,500 care experienced individuals that were interviewed and collaborating on this, and there was a plan developed from 2021 to 2024 which outlines that an acknowledgement, our evaluation is we're not doing good enough. So we've said that now, we're not hiding anywhere, so we've said it, so how do we do better? And what in North Lanarkshire we have 4 promise development workers that are care experienced, and they're invited to all of the meetings. So, and also what we're trying to get them to do is to feel confident to build up a network with the young people that are currently care experienced. So I suppose when you're thinking about trauma-informed practice, contextual safeguarding, ultimately it's relationship-based practice. It's understanding what is going on for a person, what their behaviour is communicating, and where their experiences are leading them to. So our care experienced workers are really open, really articulate, pioneering. You know, we learn as much from them as they do from us. And I'm really fortunate to manage Beth and Logan. So she was part of the care review. If whoever she speaks to, she has their hairs on their arms are always standing up. She does that to me on a weekly basis. But I think it's about actually everybody that's on this forum today are here for a reason. We're here because we're passionate about young people. We know they're marginalised. People don't particularly like teenagers, and if I had to give all of you £1 million to be a teenager for the rest of your life, you wouldn't take it, because it's a really tough time. But I think it's about getting people to realistically think about where they're at developmentally, socially. It's a really awkward phase, and then you add in the care experience, which is putting a massive kind of magnifying glass on their lives, and then people writing about them. So I think it is that's part of our kind of training within North Lanarkshire just now, is asking practitioners, what are you experiencing, what are you feeling, what are the challenges, what are the trends, and then using the trends kind of quite loosely as well, because some of it is quite risky. But I suppose I use the example of when everybody was kind of lying on benches and doing that kind of planking. And by the time we all saw it on social media, it was already out of fashion. So we need to be knowing what young people are doing, and that is only going to come from relationships with the young people. They need to tell us what's happening, build up the relationships, and then potentially they might start disclosing. So yeah, Scotland's an exciting place to be in just now, but there's a lot of work and there's a lot of acknowledgement that we need competent and confident practitioners, and systems really need to listen to how hard it is to hold some of these young people. I've been there myself. I'll always be a social work practitioner, and I'll always remember feeling that pervasive sense of hopelessness when you are faced with trying to put a simple solution on a complex issue. We need to call it complex, we need to share the load, and we need to hear what's going on for young people to make a difference.
Thank you. I want to bring Susanna in now, because when we heard earlier that trauma-informed practice goes beyond this particular set of issues for young people. It's widely debated across a range of services in England and Wales. I wonder, to what extent do you feel that these types of conversations are happening across children's social care in England and Wales at the moment?
Yeah, I think they are, and I think they're framed in quite a variety of different ways. So the work, that Carleen was articulating there is really important in kind of helping us to have a shared understanding of what we mean by the term, because within different professional bodies across the social care and health system, there are quite different understandings of what we mean by trauma-informed. There's a lot to be learnt, I think, in this space around extra-familial harm and thinking about trauma to be learnt and drawn in from other areas of experience where that's been developing in relation to intrafamilial harm, for instance, in other areas of the system. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But the one thing that I want to sort of press us on really is that all the things that Carleen and Michelle said, I totally agree with. We need to be responding early in a rights-based relational way. That's kind of what we're talking about to be truly trauma-informed. Responding individuated way to what's happened to individual children and their families, and listening and responding individually. But in doing that, we have to also balance that with understanding what is structural and societal about trauma, and what needs addressing by system leaders and by people who are trying to shape and change the system, not in the way of short-term funding for innovation on individual services and sections of the system, but actually quite robust, radical challenge to the power structures and the power relationships. Michelle talked about historical changes of perspective. If we really want a historically changing perspective that's trauma-informed, we've got to think about the structural issues that are part of that trauma experience. So, and to take it to a sort of one extreme of the debate, if we come to trauma-informed through the lens of what can be called counting ACEs, counting adverse childhood experiences, ticking a list of things that have been experienced by you as an individual, and therefore kind of individuating that experience to you as a kind of almost, you know, written off individual within our society. We need to understand what the and challenge within interprofessional work those kind of structural issues, and racism being, you know, one huge one in this context. Michelle mentioned the change around stop and search. What is that going to do for Black children's sense of safety with professionals in their own communities, where now the restrictions through have been withdrawn on stop and search, in a situation where the independent police watchdog has said in 2021 that Black people were 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people. What's that change going to do for their own sense of safety? We also know that Black young boys in the mixed heritage boys in the probation system have not been reached well by early help. There was a report in 2021 by HM Probation which showed that most of those young men had multiple and complex needs. Most had not received any support at all until becoming involved with the youth justice system. So of course we're talking about the family courts here, but we have to see that as part of a whole system where much more cheaply, you know, if you want to think about money, but much more effectively and much more relationally, if we got in earlier with those young boys, you know, they wouldn't have arguably ended up with a criminal record that was going to shape and influence the rest of their lives. Which sort of brings us to a question around courts, I think, which is about the relationship between youth justice and family justice. You know, 30 odd years ago, a decision was made, which, you know, was a rational right decision at that moment, that in England that youth justice and the family court should be separated in the way that they are now. More and more in the way that Michelle mentioned, you know, the change of historical perspective on social work activities and all of that. There's more and more overlap in the day-to-day concerns of the youth courts and the family courts. And, you know, we do need to have a robust conversation about, is that sort of primary structure the right thing? And the last thing I'd say is just listening to Nicole's really brilliant sort of work that she was articulating there. Exactly, you know, if we mean trauma informed, we have to be informed by the people who have experienced the trauma, and there's a lot to learn from you know, other parts of where family courts have been actually, you know, generated more harm. The work that's going on with recurrent care experienced parents, for instance, around the country, which is not, you know, funded by funding from DFE, but funded by hardworking professionals working to work with parents and shift things and change things and build those relationships of trust. There's great transferable learning there. So yeah, fantastic to hear about the great works going on. And I think that we in the current policy climate need to be really challenging each other and ourselves to think about trauma, not as an individuated thing, but as a structural societal thing that we have to do something about.
Thank you, Susanna. I can see lots of agreement in the chat with those points. And interestingly, Chrissy Bollinger earlier asked the question, what does the panel think about cultural safety and how this fits with the importance of community and relational safety? And I think you're raising those points. I don't know if anybody wants to come in on that point. Colleen?
I mean, I think Susanna's picked up on most of it. To be honest, I would just concur with the things that she's saying, and I was reflecting over the weekend actually because I was listening to the Kendrick Lamar album on repeat, and if people haven't listened to it yet, I would definitely recommend it, but not with a child in earshot, because it's not redacted, sanitized version, but it's excellent. And what I was left thinking the whole time I was listening to it was his descriptions of intergenerational trauma, which was highly structural and structurated. And I was then reflecting on, as Susanna said, a lot of our system comfort is describing intergenerational trauma as individually held, or at least familially held. So this child's traumatized because of this thing with their parents, and this thing with their parents was influenced by this thing with their parents, and so on and so forth. And yet, when we think about issues like racism, that intergenerational trauma is structural, and I only need to reflect on my own personal experience of taking my son to primary school in September just gone, and my husband being distraught about taking him to primary school, and not because he was older, which is what I was feeling like, oh, he's grown up, but his absolute fear about what would happen to his child in the education system because of what happened to him. And our reaction to that could be that he needs fixing because he's traumatized by the system. That recognizes some impact of structure, but actually what we need are educational systems that don't traumatize to heal that process of trauma, that intergenerational process of trauma. Whereas if you have children whose parents were policed, racialized and policed in that way, and their children are, then that is intergenerational trauma that is caused by structures. And we are seeing, I am happy to say, we are seeing in some of our data collection social workers who are challenging traumatizing practice that itself is reflective of traumatizing systems. But that type of work, that pushback from individual practitioners to managers, managers to organizations, organizations to policies, requires space in those services, and goes right back to what Michelle was saying about this being about innovation and disruption. Service improvement won't get you to that level of challenge, and it therefore won't provide young people or families with the cultural safety that they need, both in terms of the relationships they hold with each other and with professionals, but also in the services they have a right to access safely. And so we've been really thinking quite a lot about why the language of innovation is important here, and innovation at multiple levels, so that it is system changing at its greatest point in terms of structure, and not just in terms of one-to-one intervention with young people.
Thank you. Just to follow also on the point that Susanna raised about the relationship between the family justice and the youth and criminal justice systems. And we had a couple of questions in advance of the event about this. So people asking, be interested to understand the implications of a trauma-informed approach for youth justice and youth courts, and what, if any, initiatives are there in place to develop trauma-informed approaches for young people in young offender institutions. I wonder whether Nicole had anything to say specifically about the relationship with youth justice.
I suppose just to say that it's really complex and individual, and I suppose I'm thinking about some of the kind of comments that are saying about it requires safety for workers prepared to push back. We need to create systems that are able to do that, because some of the young people that are completely misunderstood, and we're the ones that are writing the reports. But again, it's about trying to actually find those innovative examples. And when Caroline was speaking about music, I'm aware that there was a practitioner that had a young person that was secured, and as part of their kind of secure proceedings, there's a letter that comes directly from our Director of Social Work, a personal letter that goes to the young person, and there should be communication back. And I remember our chief social worker was sent a song from the young person via a social worker, and as part of that was lots of kind of worrying faces that the social worker was sending, because it was completely explicit, because that's what the young person was communicating. And I think it was things like you know, there's a rain cloud over me every day. They were articulating really distressing information, but that went straight to the chief social worker, who'd made the decision that he had to be insecure. And what she did from that was she referenced a personal letter back to the young person. So there's an example where you are able to almost kind of make sure that there's some communication between these individuals, and I suppose it's finding these examples and making them more mainstream. And just to touch on some of the kind of cultural things as well, what we're finding is in North Lanarkshire, all our young people that are involved in the youth justice system are listening to like London drill. they relate to certain aspects of the themes that are coming up from there. Why are they doing that? What's the messages that are coming up? We need to hear. And so it's not about kind of turning the radio down or if there's connecting your phone to your car, it's turning it up and listen. So, and practitioners to kind of do that. The youth justice system in Scotland is under review. Where I feel big frustration, and that's hopefully some of our promise development workers are going to take forward, is that there's no communication between ourselves and as a local authority and the sheriffs. And so we want to have, because we know that relationships work, we have examples where there's a Sheriff David Mackey who has been leading on a number of reviews in Scotland, and he made it his business to know what was going on in the local community. He wanted to know, he wanted to hear what this. So the social workers were giving him reports about these young people, and he wanted to know who it was that was giving him these reports, because then he could trust them. And I suppose that's the kind of nut you're trying to crack just now, is how do we get in and have an interface? How do we have these conversations? And using, again, some of the examples that we've got is that there was a one young social worker that was aware that the sheriff was thinking of imposing a CPO, and she had an opportunity to speak within the court setting. The court was closed as well because he was a looked after young person. Not all the courts do that, but the sheriff made the decision. So it was a closed court, and she said, right, speak, tell me about your report. And she was able to articulate his trauma in real terms. And he was sitting there, he could hear the dialogue, and he could hear somebody not only champion, but just kind of framing what his experiences were. And that sheriff, so what they did impose, they imposed a CPO, and they didn't have any additional kind of like a tag and things like that, not because the social worker was able to communicate that when he is frustrated or when he is scared, he runs. And so what he would potentially do is if he ran, he might not come back to his safe space, because he would feel that if he came back and he was late or he'd missed a day or something like that, he would then be held in cells. So it was counterproductive of the work that everyone was trying to do. But it's about trying to get those situations where we can speak to the sheriffs and say, we're all in the same team. We don't want them to be in front of you. We want them to be with us and kind of productive. But I think it is about getting trust between different agencies as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think Susanna wanted to come in on this point, but I don't know if your internet is playing up, Susanna. Let's give her a second. Yeah, we might need to come back to Susanna and check that her internet's working okay. A number of additional questions coming up about the court, and some comments in the chat about the court process. Some questions about whether judges and lawyers.
I don't know if you.
Sorry, Susanna, do you want to come in? Do come in, Susanna. No, I think we're having some trouble with her internet, so we'll come back to Susanna. But yeah, just to focus on the court again for a second, because I can see some comments in the chat about the court process itself. Some questions whether panel members have come across trauma-informed training for judges and lawyers. I know that's a feature of the training that judges in family drugs and alcohol courts get, for example. So it's something that is available. I don't know whether Michelle would like to come in on that point.
Yes, I'm part of the quality circle for Sussex, and we meet very regularly, and there's been all kinds of considerations about some of these sorts of things. And in fact, our next meeting, which will be in June, we're looking at the impact on practitioners, on lawyers and so on, of working in this field in recognition of the traumatizing impact of being around very, very difficult situations. So it's really important to have all the conversation we've just had about the impact on young people, of structural harm, all of those things. But if we don't recognise actually what that can do to practitioners, then we'll fail to see, we won't fully comprehend why people behave in the way they do. I train social workers, and I see people come into the profession incredibly fired up to do everything they can to support children and young people and parents. And they get brutalized by the work that they're doing in two ways, both in relation to seeing very, very traumatized people and having that loaded upon them. Because actually, if you are empathic and you go into the work because you're empathic and you care, actually just being with that day after day, hearing the most awful stories, trying to support in the moment, does terrible things to you. We know the burnout rate is very high. We know people get very, very ill. We know people leave the profession. So those are some kind of defense mechanisms. The other kind are distancing and cutting off and becoming quite brutal and cold and not recognizing that's happening. So if we have a trauma-informed system in the way that Carleen and Nicole have both described, we're able to recognize the impact on practitioners of being in that kind of situation, understanding how it impacts upon relationships and interpersonally. We set up good supervisory mechanisms, good group supervision, other supports, counselling, all those things that can happen. So those things really, really make a difference. But what I don't see often is those happening for lawyers, and that's what lawyers say is, what can we have and what happens for the judges? Judges sit there day after day hearing very difficult cases. How do you remain open in your own mind to the traumas of all the different people in front of you? A child who's very much put at risk, a parent who's struggling with those things, a practitioner, and then all the public protection concerns that policymakers have to think about, that the police have to think about, and so on. Victims who are out there who aren't necessarily children and young people in front of you, but are experiencing harm and difficulty. You have to hold in your head a multitude of things. So how do we create a system that allows that to happen? And when they do have this young person in there who is both a victim and a perpetrator, that they can think about that, they can understand about that, and they can respond kindly, authoritatively, empathically, and work collaboratively with a young person, even while you're still working within a criminal justice paradigm.
Thank you, some really important points there. Before we have to finish, I wonder, we've heard lots of inspiring thoughts and ideas, lots of challenge about how to rethink the way we approach working with young people and address sort of structural issues. I wondered if I could ask each of the panelists to what they would advise people listening to the webinar to take away, one thing that they can easily try to do and implement within their own workplace or within their own organisation to help to take us forward in this trauma-informed way. So I haven't warned the panel, so I'm going to give you like a second just to collect your thoughts, and I'm going to pounce on Carleen first to see whether you have some advice.
Sure. I mean, I think based on the thinking in our project team at the moment, my one piece of advice would be for practitioners to ask themselves, do you feel like you know this person or someone in the network knows them, or are they simply known by your services and you know very little? And I mean that at multiple levels. So have you had the space, has the young person had the space to communicate how they experience and move around the world, and what does that mean for not only the support you offer them or others offer them, but for the push you make to managers and others around what might need to change for and around that young person. I would like to observe meetings and never hear someone say they're known to us, because it's such a loaded term and often doesn't mean that anyone in that room really knows that young person or what they need. So if we can just be more thoughtful about that, I think would start to open up a more trauma-informed conversation.
Thank you, that's great. Nicole.
I would say that you matter as whoever you are in a young person's life. It is making a difference and you're leaving an imprint, and I think that that's really important to remember, and probably as well to use your intuition, really think about self-reflection, because I suppose what we kind of find is if you are working in a really complex system, I mentioned earlier, kind of pervasive hopelessness. Sometimes that's a mirror of what's going on for that young person, and actually having a kind of critical friend to talk things through with, you see that you're containing everybody, you're feeling that, and you need to acknowledge what's going on for you. Have somebody that you can trust, that you can talk to. I suppose I do have some reservations about reflective supervision. If I think it needs to be the right person, you need to have a connection with. I don't think it's something we could just impose with practitioners. I think they need to develop who they want to open up to, because I suppose we are we're antennae for what's going on, and I think I do feel that practitioners just acknowledgement from managers that they've had a tough day, or checking in with them, it's so valued. We are seeing it time and time again with in the consultations, just saying, this is tough, this is a rough day, how are you? And it just having that kind of sense of humanity and remembering that practitioners are dealing with really, really tough things day in, day out, and some of them are not sleeping, they're worried sick, and sometimes they just want to tell you that before they get into the nitty-gritty of the cases. And as managers, we need to see that as a strength, not a deficit. They're telling us what's going on. So yeah, that's my takeaway.
That's a great one to have. Thank you. I'm not sure whether Susanna can hear me.
I can, yeah.
Brilliant. Did you hear my question?
I did, yeah. I wasn't able to do what I would suggest, in the middle, because I couldn't hear what you were saying, but it seems like listening is really key. Listening across the system. So earlier I was going to refer to that work we did for NFJO case file audits, where young people's involvement with criminal justice was very little known to their social workers in many of those cases. Listening and hearing and understanding the bigger picture, which takes time, and the kind of support for practice that Nicole is talking about. And listening to, if we really want to reshape a trauma-informed system, we have to listen to the people who have experienced that trauma and be able to hold and hear that in the supported way that Nicole is talking about. Social media has created a fantastic way in which we can hear, and we have some really powerful national voices of care experience young people, and of care experienced parents as well. But those people are everywhere in all local authority areas, and we need to be able to develop ways and means to do the work and to reshape the system locally that actually hears and respectfully listens to what they're saying.
Thank you, that's great. And Michelle?
And I think I would just add that remembering that young people's behaviour is a form of communication. So it's telling us something about what they've experienced, something about what they're feeling, and what we need to do is respond to that underlying experience, and not just any difficult behaviour that we're seeing on top of that.
Brilliant. Well, listen, that's all we have time for, but I really want to thank you all for attending today's event, and a particular thank to Carleen Furman, to Michelle Lefebvre, to Susanna Boyer, and to Nicole Savage for that really interesting discussion. If you want to find out more about our work relating to young people, please do visit our website, which is nuffieldfjo.org.uk. And if you go to the website, you can also register to receive our regular bulletin at nuffieldfjo.org.uk/subscribe. I know we've put into the chat our feedback form. We'd be really grateful if you had just to spare a minute to fill in our event feedback form, because we use those to think about how to improve our future events. But for now, that's been a really fascinating discussion. I hope you found it valuable. I've certainly enjoyed people's comments and questions throughout the session, and look forward to seeing you at future FJO events. Many thanks.